Okay, hello everyone, I'm Raul Hakli.
I'm Pekka, as Lisa already said. It's a pleasure to be here, and a bit strange to open the meeting with this kind of a talk because you changed the topic. It was redefining agency, and now we saw that it is reconceptualizing.
So we have to gear our talk a little bit to this new direction.
This makes us slightly nervous. But anyway, we are sort of a stand-in replacement for the original keynote, so we have more leaders than other speakers will in this conference. So maybe you should take this as more like a warm-up when you guys start with defining and reconceptualizing agency. We just walked you into the topic with our sort of modest 101 talk.
Yeah, so and this is more from a philosophical perspective. We're both philosophers. Well, Pekka studied law too, but I haven't any idea of legal matters anyway, so if I say something stupid, don't sue me. So the idea is agency in frames, and what we mean with frames is like frameworks, like, well, there are many kinds of frameworks. One very familiar to philosophers is kind of conceptual frameworks, and the conceptual frameworks that we are accustomed to with related to agency comes from the philosophical action theory in the analytic philosophy of action. But there are many other frameworks in which agency is a topic, like there are scientific disciplines, social practices, institutional contexts, and normative practices in which agency plays a role.
Yeah, and to further explain our background, so that you can place ours on the map, as it were, we've done work from the point of view of traditional action theory and analytic philosophy, and then, as Lisa already said, quite a bit on social action, group action in relation to social ontology. We will say a few things, few words perhaps about that, but so you know that we are going to be slightly conservative and old-fashioned perhaps in what we say. But the frame idea is not supposed to be in any sense innovative, original idea. It's just that we think that now, because of the disruptive technology and all these things, it seems that we are under pressure to redefine the intention and the extension of agency concepts and all that. That maybe it's useful to bring up the idea that all these concepts and notions, they work in certain kinds of contexts. And it's very important to identify the functions and the meanings of those practices in which they appear, so that we can critically evaluate whether there really is pressure to play with the notion of agency, rather than maybe the problem is somewhere else. But that's not supposed to be any kind of social scientific innovation idea. It's very down-to-earth idea.
Yeah. So agency is a term that is used in many contexts, and of course there's a wide range of things that are called agents, and we'll come to that very soon. But here are some examples, like agency in travel agency, or social constraints on the members' opportunities to express their political agency, authority and agency. So our aim is not to do some philosophical police work in the sense that we would say that, okay, this is agency and that's it, and all that, but we kind of try to be sensitive to the contextual idea that agency is a topic in many fields, and we try to see what is common to these senses, and maybe then kind of define, or at least try to characterize some philosophically interesting and important senses of agency.
And from our point of view, and that also narrows down our scope of competence, we've been mainly focused on agency issues, not only on the basis of the action theory in analytic philosophy, but from the point of view of responsibility, moral responsibility practices, trust and things like that. So we are mainly interested in normative frames, as it were, also legal.
But here are some things that are usually called as agents. I mean, the simplest kinds of agents are like chemical substances, like detergent is some kind of a chemical agent that has interaction with its environment and changes things in its environment, then we can think maybe plants as some sort of agents, as at least they seem to behave in certain ways that may look like agentive, like plants following the sun, at least according to some theories, like enactive theories, they actually could count as agents just on the basis of that. Animals quite clearly are agents, like human children, grown-up human beings are perhaps the most sophisticated agents that we know. Well, groups of animals or groups of humans are perhaps in some sense even more complicated because they consist of individuals. Then corporations, which are kind of organized, complex collectives of individuals. And then of course we have AI programs and social robots, which are kind of artificial agents. We also often talk about corporations and collectives, organizations as artificial agents. Because
at least we do.
Yeah,
well, not everyone
because they are kind of constructed agents, constructed by humans. But if there is some kind of a minimal sense of agency, well, we tried to think of what could be something general that somehow connects all these agents, and at least maybe something like this we could say that of this minimal sense of agency. So an agent is an entity which can be in interaction with its environment and has some kind of causal capacity to influence its environment. This is something like perhaps the common core to all these types of agents. It's not meant to be a definition, but some kind of a loose characterization of
yeah, and it is pretty much a first step, because we were just thinking that maybe there is an analogy. People talk about autonomy all the time, and autonomous cars, autonomous states, autonomous human beings. Obviously, there seems to be something shared because they end up picking the same word. But actually, the role and the employment or the deployment of the notion is totally different. So maybe this would be some kind of a family name, something like this, in this ballpark. And indeed, I'm not sure how important this is, actually, because it's kind of a family resemblance idea anyway. And in some contexts, like Raul mentioned, like the chemical substances, I'm not sure how much the theorizing depends on having a very well-defined, necessary and sufficient conditions definition of agent in that context. They just know that it's something that is interacting with something, and I'm sure they could use something else. So nothing hangs, like serious intellectual things hangs on this, whether this is exactly correct, but maybe something in that ballpark, I think.
Yeah. But then there are perhaps more interesting types of agents than chemical agents, for instance. So we kind of are mainly concentrating on three different types. So we mentioned already the minimal sense of agent, but then at least in philosophy, the notion of intentional agency is a very important one. And that is the thing that the philosophical theory of action focuses on. And intentional agents are agents that are capable of intentional action. That is roughly the idea. So, and here we can talk about, well, I guess I don't know much about animal agency, but I would assume that animals are capable of intentional action. At least they have intentional states, and that is one necessary condition for being an agent. Often in philosophy we talk about beliefs, desires, and intentions. These are kind of three types of mental states or intentional states that agents are assumed to have, even though there is debate whether intentions are required, whether it's enough just to have beliefs and desires. But in any case, that is the kind of basic idea of an agent. That an agent is someone who has some kind of representational states, beliefs, and some kind of motivational states, desires, and then it can engage in intentional action in order to satisfy its desires in light of its beliefs. This is the kind of basic idea.
Some people try to identify these two different types of states in terms of direction of fit, like beliefs are states in which we try to fit our mental picture of the world to the world, and whereas in the case of desires, it is world to mind kind of direction of fit, where we try to change the world in accordance with our desires. That's that keeps the intentional agent moving, as it were, roughly in this picture. But intentions, then they are like constraining mental state, committing the agent to the action, and narrowing down screening out the contradictory alternatives as long as you maintain the intention. And I think Lilian in the audience is better specialist on this, but I think that's a PDI architecture is the dominating view in the action theory today. Namely, that means that we take intentions as a necessary element in our understanding of actions in philosophy.
Yeah, but then the next level that is interesting to philosophers is the concept of moral agent, and moral agents are agents that are intentional agents that are also capable of bearing moral responsibility. They have rights and responsibilities, or obligations and responsibilities. The question of rights is somewhat distinct. Often also philosophers distinguish between agents and patients, and agency comes with responsibilities, duties, obligations, and patiency with rights. But in any case, the important thing is that moral agency in philosophical sense requires something more than just intentional agency. And this is the main thing that we want to talk about.
Further down the line, we will talk about the requirements or the conditions for moral agents in terms of their capacities. This is just, I think, many people agree that that's the reference of a moral agent. But then when we talk about the population, which are the moral agents, then we need to find out what the requirements are. And there the dispute starts, I suppose.
Yeah. So here is just a schematic picture of the action theory notion of agents. This comes from Christian List and Philip Petit's book on group agency, where they talk about agency and responsibility. In any case, the idea of agent, and this is not necessarily a moral agent yet, this is just an intentional agent, even though responsibility is mentioned here, but responsibility usually is understood as an agentive notion, so you cannot be a responsible agent unless you're an intentional agent, and these are the conditions of intentional agency. So basically these are the BDI conditions. So an intentional agent is something that has representational states that tell the agent how the environment is. This is what is usually called as beliefs. Then it has motivational states that specify how it requires the environment to become or to be. So this is the desires or goals, or motivational states more generally, or pro-attitudes as philosophers often call them. And then in addition to these two types of intentional states, the agents also have to have some kind of capacity to process these intentional states so that it can form intentions or act intentionally towards satisfying its desires in light of the way that the agent understands the world to be, that is, in light of the beliefs. This is the basic sense of intentional agency. And intentional states, beliefs, desires, possibly intentions, they are usually or often or always understood as being intentional in the sense that they have some content that is about the actual world. So intentional states are about something. They have a content that is about things outside or inside, but at least outside the agent. So I can have a desire to go out, but I may have a belief that it's raining, and then I have to process these beliefs so that I also want to remain dry, but I want to go out, so I have to think what to do, and then I find an umbrella or find an indoors way to somehow go out without getting wet and all that. And this is the idea of rationality or something like that. But in any case, intentional agents somehow should act in light of their beliefs and desires.
Just a correcting footnote to what Raul said, because he said that responsibility is considered an agentive notion. Of course, when we talk about normative agency, but as there are many notions of agency, they sort of map to different kinds of notions of responsibility. And if you talk about causal responsibility, actually it's not an agentive notion, but we are only interested in agentive notions of responsibility.
True. Yeah, and List and Petit are also talking about
normative sense of responsibility.
And this is where this comes from.
Yeah, that's right. Right. And that was, as Visa said, the Kantian kind of idea, even though in our view it was not Kantian and we didn't express anything Kantian in there, but at least in this respect. It was about individual agent.
Yeah.
And what we've been working on with Raimo Tuomela for quite a while, or as having been his students, learned from him at least, and wrote some joint papers trying to understand how that kind of understanding of intentional agency could be applied to shared agency or collective action and maybe actions of groups that we tend to attribute actions to groups. How does that take place and what would be a correct kind of analysis of that? And of course, together we can bring about much more harm than alone. So it is also interesting concept or conceptual space from the point of view of normative issues how to go about moral responsibility or legal responsibility when there are more agents jointly bringing about the harm. And these collective responsibility has been one of our sort of focus research topics. But this also relates, this is a bit of a side tour. We didn't think about talking about it, but Visa sort of invited us to say something. The social ontology movement was based on collective intentionality ideas that we jointly can act intentionally. We can bring about variety of things together. Namely, we can construct institutional reality pretty much jointly, collectively, and we can understand that wonder in terms of collective intentionality concepts that are developed in this joint action and collective action theory. And there's it used to be called a collective intentionality series that actually we were establishing in late 90s. But now, because Americans have taken over, they decided to change the name to social ontology, which is sexier and better topic, but still the core idea, at least what they called, what is the idealistic social ontology, is that actually we collectively maintain the social institutional reality because we can make things true by believing them to be true. Like we collectively, for good reasons, accept that Visa Kurki is a professor at the university, but it's not his natural property. It's collectively conferred property, and that's the major idea in social ontology. But this is a bit of a detour for our talk today.
Yeah. But anyway, and for those who don't know, but Raimo Tuomela was a professor of philosophy here in Helsinki, and he was really one of those pioneers of this collective intentionality social ontology movement that is quite big nowadays. And it was one of his original ideas that, okay, if you look at groups, especially organized groups, you can see some kind of parallel to individual agents. So until 60s and 70s, the focus had been only on individual agents, but he was one of the first who really noticed that there's some kind of an analogy, that also collectives, they have goals, and they have some understanding of how the world is. So these are like beliefs and desires, and they have various kinds of collective decision-making mechanisms. So they are also, in some sense, capable of intentional action, or at least they can be viewed as intentionally acting. He was also famous for his quite complicated way of writing, and you will see soon some examples. But here is his definition of joint or shared agency. So agents.
This is not the funny part yet.
Yeah,
the next one will be.
Have the joint intention to perform a joint action X if and only if A, these agents have the we intention to perform X, and B, there is a mutual belief among them to the effect that A holds. That's namely that these agents have the we intention. Okay, and then this was his definition of what it means for agents to jointly intend to do something. But then there is this curious term, we intention, which is not yet defined because the usual terms were just beliefs and desires and intentions. So what is this we intention? Well, he gave a definition, and It is
And actually,
really-
that's the term that made him famous. So the we intention is how we, at that time, he was kind of an individualistic philosopher still, and the idea was that how we can deal with this jointness and we-ness in terms of attitudes that are mine. Like how am I the individual in we, and how we intentionally join our forces, as it were, to come up with a jointly intentional action. And this is the analysis. We won't read it, but it looks easy, right? And very, very snappy. But there's a philosophical content of it, which is pretty much what Raul already said. But the link at this stage is the mutual beliefs, that we can have beliefs, loop beliefs about each other. And that's how we link, and that's at the core of on top of the normal individual intentional action, that we can see that we are sharing a goal, and we can, because he's sharing the goal with me, and I believe that he does, which is actually, we need that for practical reasoning. If I wouldn't believe that Raul will join me in giving a joint talk, I wouldn't come here. So we need these loops.
Yep. Okay. Okay, and then we jump to the status. So when we go beyond intentional agency, we are interested in the normative things like questions about responsibility, maybe also the status, like the rights stuff and all that. And nowadays especially, well, there is this tendency to kind of extend the sphere of agents that matter morally, or maybe have some obligations or duties or responsibilities, and this is the kind of thing that we have called extending agency, extending the scope of kind of morally significant agents.
There are two different important senses of extending the agency. One thing is that, like in literature on extended agency, where we think that it's not only me and it's not in my head, it's my phone and my pen and pencil that constitutes the whole that has the capacities of an agent. That's one way of extending, say, maybe the intention of the term.
Yeah.
But then the other way is to extend agency, which is different literature and different topic, and shouldn't be confused with one another, is scope extension, namely that we include, from our point of view, to the extension like robots or AI agents or corporate actors or what have you, that we consider artificial agents. And that's basically the literature we try to contribute to. We've done some work on extended agency as well, related to AI and extension of our agental capacities, but our main focus is on the debate concerning the scope. And there, I suppose, we are not politically conservative, no, hell no, but philosophically conservative in the sense that maybe it might be an idea to try work out how much we can do with the old machinery we already have, and not to rush extending our concepts to apply things that are obviously somewhat different, because the practices probably have some kind of reason for having the conditions they have for the agency used in that context. So our methodological idea is that maybe we go cautiously ahead with extending the scope and think about the conditions of the practice and the requirements that are internal to the practice as well. And these are a bit of a resting bench, but it is obvious that there are many, we can distinguish many elements and dimensions in these debates. We could call them debate. Of course, there's a debate whether robots are or can ever be moral agents, or whether they already are, and whether LLMs are agents, or whether they act intentionally, whether they should be considered responsible for their actions and everything. But there's a sort of abstract level of how to define and determine the content of agency requirement in the first place. And that's the sort of abstract methodological question. And the other, more like normatively motivated question is, should we change the agency requirements of our moral practices? I think I'm not into that literature well enough to say this with much confidence, but some literature I've read about animal rights and stuff. There it seems that the moral pressure is the thing that is driving perhaps the wish to change our conditions of agency or something like that. And then, of course, the most down-to-earth kind of debate is the empirical one. We have to decide whether the robot causing all kinds of harm is having the properties we require from, say, a responsible agent, and whether we should attribute responsibility to the robot. And this is, of course, one source of these debates is these responsibility issues, which we are going to say a few things, couple of slides down.
Yep. But then there is the question of how should we determine the questions concerning moral agency, moral responsibility. And some people argue that, well, there are certain kind of metaphysical conditions that agents, and especially moral agents, must have, and we have to kind of follow from our ontology and metaphysics and then decide on the basis of these. But then there are others who think that, well, actually our normative intuitions and normative ideals should have the priority, like Virginia holds this view that actually we should decide our views based on our moral conceptions rather than our metaphysical intuitions. So if, according to her, if there is a contradiction between our metaphysical ideas, if we, for instance, want to include some, if we feel that we should include, for instance, animals or robots or some other things into our moral community, then we should do that in spite of our metaphysical ideas that they might lack certain capabilities that we would like to have. Then we should either just live with these contradictory ideas or revise our metaphysical ideas and hold on to the normative ideas. But then there are others who have the opposite view.
Of course, that's philosophically, for a philosopher, it's kind of unsatisfactory if our metaphysics, philosophy of language, and our normative views don't sit nicely together. I think there's a bit of a worry in that approach, but of course it emphasizes the importance and significance of moral considerations. The paper we were referring to here, and won't discuss much more after this, but is group responsibility for ethnic conflict. That was just right after the war in Yugoslavia. That's the case she's going through. There's a lot of emotion in the paper too, but I recommend it. It was written 2001. It's a good paper, even though I think substance-wise we think that maybe we should go after the coherence after all, not live with the contradiction because it's somewhat unsatisfactory. But part of that kind of problem that health example sort of evidenced has to do, at least according to our interpretation or guess or hypothesis, as you like, if you like, has to do with identifying the normative practices correctly. And here the lawyers are as in social ontology in general, they have a very important appreciated, under-theorized role. But I think many philosophers say in economics, they talk about corporate responsibility, limited liability things, and it seems, I think to Raul and me, last week there was a meeting in Dublin on collective intention, there was a social ontology meeting, and there was one of the keynotes was on limited liability and its moral basis. And I think, with all respect, I won't say the name, but he really got, at the end of the talk, confused whether he was talking about legal responsibility, which I think probably gives you a little bit more elbow room than the moral responsibility. And the argumentations changed in tone in a way that actually it seemed that after all, without noting it himself, he was talking about legal responsibility instead of moral responsibility. And I think it's good evidence that even though it's not much of a brainer to say that practices are different, it may be in certain contexts when people get carried away with the normative importance, it's good to remind that actually these practices and the contextualization of the debate is a very important thing.
So, there are different kind of normative practices that are relevant in different contexts, and in order to understand what is the level of agency presupposed by certain type of normative practices, we must have an understanding of the nature and purpose of the practice. What is the function of the practice of holding agents responsible, for instance? And maybe it's different in legal matters and in moral matters. Do you want to say something about straws?
At this context?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, but part of the interest, I suppose, the pressure, at least in philosophy, and now I mention Lilian again, one of the PhD students who worked on a Straussonian approach on moral responsibility, she came up, I think, with kind of radical views about conditions of moral agency. And it was an excellent PhD work. And I think she's wrong, but she's a very good philosopher. But that's at the core of the debate. Many people that emphasize the importance of practices, they are inspired by a Straussonian way of approaching the issues of responsibility, because according to Straussonian view at its core, it is more important to understand how we hold agents responsible, and that sort of is prior to whether they are responsible, and that's a bit of a theoretical divide. Some of us think that people, first they are or they are not responsible, and then it is either right or not to hold them responsible. And this is a divide. What we are going to say, I think nothing hangs on that, but a lot of this literature is inspired by Straussonian view. And then if you have a Straussonian view, you think that's what Strawson was after, that is a very stick and carrot kind of thing, that is a kennel form, that actually you just kick the dog and it learns and then it becomes responsible because it doesn't behave badly anymore. I think the whole idea of Straussonian practice is totally different. It is to edify us as human beings, and the requirements are way higher. But I'm as wrong as the PhD person, I suppose, but she thinks I'm wrong and I think she's wrong. But anyway, that's probably evidence of something more general.
Yeah. Then there are these different frames mentioned, legal frame and moral frame, and there are somewhat different kinds of rules. It's not clear what exactly is the relation between the moral sphere and the legal sphere. There are many views, like in some sense it would be good if the law tracked morality so that it would be compatible with our moral ideas. On the other hand, it could be said, some people think that, well, actually, law somehow defines what is right and what is wrong, but then, according to others, it's also possible to evaluate law in terms of moral matters. So some laws may actually be in contradiction with our moral ideas. But in any case, it seems that they have somewhat different ideas, and some matters may be relevant, or some considerations may be relevant in the legal sphere. For instance, maybe whether we decide to treat corporations as agents, as moral agents, in some sense as agents that can be held responsible, it may not matter only on metaphysics or morality, but maybe some economical reasons, like that way we can make economy run smoothly. So this is, of course, a consideration that is not really relevant in the moral sphere, whether we should hold organizations or corporations as morally responsible?
Yeah, the claim would be that, especially if you're some kind of a Kelsen kind of legal positivist, you have quite a bit of elbow room for defining the law the ways you want, and also the objects that we want to talk about in law. But when I already mentioned that sometimes these practices get confused. I think we still have something, but we have many slides too. But it goes both ways, because in like legal persons, they have a role and this function in legal theorizing, which is pretty understandable. And as far as my knowledge goes, my brother is a lawyer and he would back me up. It really has a good function to do and work in legal context. But it's also, there's this fiction theory that some legal theorists think that we can admit that they are not like real persons, or at least they should be distinguished from natural persons, and that's why we can adopt like fiction theory of corporate actors like legal persons, something like that. Visa looks a bit not, but it's in that ballpark. Anyway, and some philosophers borrow the fictitious idea, like Raimo Tuomela at his latest days when he started to get a little bit more collectivist. He started talking about fictitious agents in the context of moral theorizing or action theory. And excuse my French, I always kept asking, what the heck is that? And it makes things just more confused. It works well in the legal context, but it doesn't work well in the action theory context, because our job would be to make the metaphysics clearer. And if we borrow the fiction theory from legal context to action theory or moral context, I think we get just more confused and no clarity at all. But that's pretty much what I...
Yeah. Okay, then there's a topic that is quite often discussed nowadays. It's the topic of responsibility gaps. And this is something that is nowadays discussed in the context of technology, but it used to be a topic already earlier in theories of collective action. And the idea is that sometimes there are cases in which there is some harm happening as a result of many people. And actually none of these people can be individually held responsible, but somehow we would like to hold them collectively responsible. Because otherwise no one is responsible for some bad things that happened, and that is somewhat problematic according to intuition of many people. And nowadays the question is, of course, when automated technology causes some harm, and it is something that is unpredictable or somehow otherwise something that no individual can be held responsible, then there are some who suggest that, okay, maybe we should hold these systems, sophisticated learning AI systems whose actions cannot be predicted and all that, maybe we should hold them responsible in some cases. And a few years ago there was even a suggestion in the EU legal system to implement something like this. Maybe we can skip this.
We are running out of time, so we are seriously running out of time.
Well, maybe the main point is just that it's a bit of an idea of wishful thinking to think that somebody should always be responsible of everything bad. So maybe there actually are sometimes responsibility gaps in which no one is responsible. But
then these cases also support our major claim, which is very deep, namely that the context matters, because it's the Good Samaritan mishap kind of cases. They are a pretty obvious counterexample to necessity to attribute the responsibility to someone. Because it philosophically, if I may, sounds a bit childish to think that if something morally untoward or undesirable in the world takes place, someone must be responsible. That's not the case. Sometimes shit just happens. And Good Samaritan mishaps are the cases where people have good intentions, accidentally they bring about some untoward outcome, but obviously it doesn't follow metaphysically or normatively or in any sensible way that there's a dyad or there's a group that must be responsible for the harm. No, it doesn't work that way. So we need to analyze, in all these gap cases, I suppose we should run a proper analysis of the case and how we define the track, how we track down the responsibility as it were.
Yeah. Okay, then it is clear that there are many senses of responsibility, and maybe the most usual senses in which responsibility is discussed is causal responsibility. Something or someone is just causally responsible for something, and there this, we think, kind of corresponds to the minimal notion of agency, something that can be in interaction with its environment, and it doesn't have to be an agent in any intentional or moral sense. But then there is legal sense of responsibility, and we think that this has something to do with the intentional agency. And then there is the moral responsibility, and this we think is connected to moral agency, which is the most interesting in our view. So we need to
Rush up.
Rush up a little.
Because at the end is the only interesting thing we are about to say, so we have to get there.
Yeah. So maybe we skip some of these.
Yeah. The point is that this is a repetition of the Strawsonian point, but the core of it is that further down the line we want to go and ask what are the moral responsibility agency requirements in the broadly taken Strawsonian view. And then we try to give some content, tentative content of course, and which we hope you to redefine during these 3 days and tell us the result, of course. But that's the warm-up for our arguments to come. Yeah. That actually the bar of moral agency is pretty high, and it's not intentional agency. We need more, and the justification for this would run in terms of the function of the practices in the context of which we deploy moral agency, namely, primarily, the practice of holding agents morally responsible for their actions. And because it's a normative practice, the same rules apply to the practice itself. And the argument for the certain kinds of requirements for the agency, that is fit to be held morally responsible, follow from the fact that if these conditions wouldn't be satisfied, it would be unfair. Like in the case of a child, in the case of a dog, we have 5 minutes, and now we really have to rush up.
You can take a bit more if you want. Just let's have a Q&A.
Yeah. Anyway,
Okay,
then
so
we can.
Here is a rather standard philosophical conditions for agents to be fit to be held responsible, and these come from Philip Pettit. So it's value relevance, value judgment, and value sensitivity. Value relevance means that the agent is an autonomous agent, faces a value relevant choice involving the possibility of doing something good or bad, or right or wrong. Value judgment means that the agent has the understanding and access to evidence required for being able to make judgments about the relative value of the options available. And value sensitivity means that the person has or the agent has the control necessary for being able to choose between options on the basis of judgment about their value.
And there's a repetition of those conditions in other terms, namely more action theory kind of terminology, but it provides the same kind of description of an agent that satisfies the Pettit kind of fitness to be held morally responsible conditions. And this, we don't spend much time on this, but this was just an example of how high the bar can be. Like after a couple of beers, I don't satisfy the conditions McKenna sets for a moral agency. So, but I still think it is a very interesting idea, or if you think our practices of moral responsibility to have something to do with our idea of edifying ourselves. So I should be able to, when I behave, intentionally evaluate what kind of will do I express and how do you read my reasons for acting the way I do. And I promise after maybe 4 beers, 2 beers, maybe still some, but after that, no. It's extremely socially demanding. But we won't spend much time on this, but we can talk about it in the Q&A if someone wants.
But let's consider then a couple of candidates that have been suggested recently to be fit to be held responsible, that is, to be moral agents. So AI systems and robots, collective agents, corporations and organizations, and hybrid agents that we take to be collections of agents, some of who are individual humans and some are AI systems or robots. So usually it's taken that, well, robots, whether they are agents or not, that's controversial. I mean, in everyday language and according to many philosophical traditions, robots and AI systems can be understood as agents. They can be understood as having beliefs and desires and some kind of decision-making mechanism to make decisions and act in the world. Then there are some theories according to which actually that's not the case. These are not even intentional beings. Like the famous John Searle's Chinese room argument aims to show that actually computers and robots, they just deal with syntax, namely ones and zeros. They don't have intentional states that are about the external world in any sense. And if that is the case, then they are not even agents because they don't have intentional states. However, according to functionalists who just identify certain kind of states that correspond or do the same function as mental states in humans and other intentional agents, they count as intentional states. Also, interpretivists, like Daniel Dennett's intentional stance idea, takes intentionality to be a matter of interpretation. So if we can, or if our best way of making sense of how robots and AI systems act involve attributing to them intentional states, then they are intentional. Okay, in any case, intentionality or intentional agency is just a precondition for moral responsibility, so it's not enough. Whether they could be, in addition, if we just admit that, okay, we can take them to be intentional agents, can they still be moral agents? Well, commonly we think that even though human beings are moral agents, AI systems or robots are not. But there are not many conceptually strong arguments against robots and AI systems being moral agents. There are many who claim that the current AI systems and current robots are not moral agents because they don't have emotion or emotions or moral understanding or empathy or whatever you might require for moral agency. But we try to devise a conceptual argument against robots and AI systems being moral agents.
Well, maybe we should go to this slide because we are over time already.
Which?
The one that we have all the three arguments collectively.
That's fine.
Because this is the slide that sort of collects and gathers together all the ingenious ideas we had to share. And they are concerned with artificial agents. One is against collectives as moral agents. And there the idea is that because of the way intentional action, even in the case of strongly unified and incorporated collectives takes place, actually it would be unfair to hold corporate or collective agents morally responsible for their actions because the action execution depends on the individuals. This has many dimensions which I'm not going to go into at the moment, but that's the core idea of my PhD, and they accepted it, so it's valid science, as it were. And the other one, which nowadays, it used to be work in progress, now I'm afraid it's work in regress. It's our argument that Raul mentioned of robots, and now you can give that run.
Yeah, the basic idea is that we subscribe to a theory of autonomy and responsibility developed by Al Mealy, and according to him, one thing that matters to whether agents can be held morally responsible is the history of how they became the agents they currently are. So it's not just about how they are currently and what capacities and what values and goals they have, but also how they were developed. And one example would be that if somebody intentionally robs a bank freely and by their own decision, they are autonomous agents and should be held morally responsible. But if somebody hypnotizes someone to rob a bank and there's nothing that this hypnotized person can do but only go and rob a bank, then they should not be held morally responsible. And our idea was to apply these kinds of ideas to robots and AI systems, and actually we think that AI systems and robots are by definition agents whose actions depend on some kind of hypnotization or manipulation, namely programming and designing these systems. And they don't really have a choice but to do what the program and the data that they get from the outside tell them to do. So that's why they are not really source of authentic motivations that would warrant keeping them autonomous and morally responsible.
Right. And hybrid agency, we just combine these two arguments pretty much, and the conditions of joint action, and we end up that hybrid agency, which is quite often offered as a solution to the problem that Raul mentioned, that actually we could somehow share the responsibility. We argue that we couldn't. And this last slide is for you, the sort of old men wish that this is a very important conference. You are going to respond to the worries we have about uncritical extension of our agency concepts. Thank you.
Thank you.
51 minutes, by the way.